1980s was one hell of a time to be a crime reporter in Southeast Florida. I moved down from South Carolina in the spring of 1980, and in doing so, almost doubled my salary from $17,000 to $31,000 a year, which for an entry-level reporter was crazy big money back then. I wasn't even working for any of the major Miami papers either. I was working for a smaller, much more localized publication you might know, the Pinecrest Pioneer. It's a very morbid fact of journalism that if it bleeds, it leads, and the paper's circulation had been up ever since the drug violence in Miami started spilling out into the suburbs. It could be really gruesome stuff, too. We're talking gang reprisals, random killings, even bombings, hence why my new salary was so good. But the thing you start to notice, after a while of covering this kind of gruesome thing, is the corrosive effect it has on wider society. It's like something gets into the water supply or infects the collective consciousness, and for a time, it seemed almost every other person in Pinecrest was up to no good. And I think that, for me personally, the clearest example of this involved what I like to call the biggest story I never wrote. On Saturday, October 31st of 1981, there was a party at one of the big houses over on Marquesa Drive. A wealthy boat salesman had allowed his 17-year-old daughter to throw a Halloween costume party in their backyard. She invited all her friends. They had the night of their lives. Then, around midnight, the boat salesman pulled the plug and then politely called time on the party. Everyone filed out into the streets outside, and then slowly but surely all the girls' friends began to safely make their way home, all except one. The next morning, the parents of a girl named Christine Parks reported her missing to the Miami-Dade Police Department, and initially, the prognosis was not good. All the houses on Marquesa Drive, as well as the streets that surrounded it, are all built onto a kind of artificial canal which allows the homeowners to dock their boats right next to their backyards. The police quickly theorized that since some of the girls had snuck alcohol into the party, Kristen had walked off on her own, fallen into the water, and drowned. Some had their doubts because no one had heard any yelling or splashing, but still the cops dragged the canal for any human remains, if only to be able to rule it out as a possibility. But no human remains were ever found. 3 days into the search, and with law enforcement becoming increasingly desperate, a trucker was driving past the lake at the top of the South Dixie Highway when he saw a half-naked girl staggering out of a patch of trees near the side of the road. He stopped his truck, jumped out, then after using his jacket to give the girl some dignity, he asked what she was doing out there all alone with half her clothes on. The trucker later said that the girl seemed drunk, and that she didn't remember where she was or how she'd got there. The only thing she remembered was her name, Kristen Parks. As you can imagine, Kristen's family were elated to see that she had returned alive, but she was not returned unharmed. Following a thorough medical examination, it was determined that Kristen had been drugged, abducted, then repeatedly and brutally violated over the course of the next 48 hours. Then, instead of killing her, her abductors drugged her one final time, then drove her out to the South Dixie Highway in the middle of the night and dumped her in a wooded area. Kristen had been relatively calm and stable while under the drug's residual effects, but once she sobered up, it was a different story entirely. The trauma of what she'd experienced over those past few days was simply too much for her young mind to handle, and from what I understand, she suffered a total nervous breakdown. She withdrew from school, stopped seeing friends, and despite undergoing a rather radical course of medication and therapy, Kristen remained mentally and emotionally crippled by the horrors she glimpsed through the hazy mists of her memory. But what made things 1,000 times worse was the fact that the search for her attackers very quickly ground to a halt. The investigation's lack of progress was greeted with fear and concern by Pinecrest citizens, and some were extremely vocal in their demands for justice, but none more so than the boat salesman whose home the party took place in. This is the point where I have to change some names to protect both you and I from some pretty nasty lawsuits, I imagine. And from what I understand, our boat salesman is still a very litigious man, and I'd hate to see you be punished for doing me the service of reading this out loud. So instead of referring to him by his real name, I'll just call him by another, Mr. Stone. And Stone had personally offered up to $10,000 reward to anyone who helped bring Kristen's attackers to justice, and had even offered to hire a private investigator to expedite the process. With regards to the second point, Kristen's family declined his charity, but Mr. Stone remained highly and publicly vocal in his demands for justice, and he even put up a billboard outside his showroom for a while, begging the public for further information. When we met at a charity auction in the spring of 1982, it was him that actually suggested that I start investigating the whole thing, and he offered his full cooperation in the hopes that my reporting contributed to catching Kristen Park's abductors. I couldn't work the case full-time. I still had other assignments to complete, but my editor gave me full permission to work on it whenever and wherever I could, provided he got the first option to publish it. The police had never arrested or charged anyone with Kristen's abduction, but they'd still questioned a handful of suspects in relation to the incident. The first was a young man Kristen had supposedly been dating, who had reacted badly when she broke up with him. He too had been at the party, but thanks to various alibis, he was ruled out as a suspect. The second person questioned was a security guard hired by Mr. Stone to ensure the partygoers stayed away from the canal at the rear of the house. The security guard said that at one point during the evening, Kristen had approached him to begin a conversation. The guard claimed Kristen showed signs of intoxication, so fearing that someone had smuggled alcohol into the party, which they had, he went to inform Mr. Stone. Stone instructed the security guard to head back outside, find the source of the alcohol, and then confiscate it. But when the guard returned outside, Kristen Parks was nowhere to be seen. Assuming she'd simply run off to hide among the throng of dancing teenagers, the guard simply carried on doing his job, trying to figure out where the booze was coming from. He didn't see Kristen again that evening, and it wasn't until the next morning that he learned that she was missing. The third person the cops questioned, and who for a while was considered their prime suspect, was an ex-con who lived on a construction site out on Mashta Island. Mashta is one of South Florida's most affluent neighborhoods, and with most of the homes there offering more than 10,000 square feet, with high-end amenities such as gourmet kitchens, wine vaults, and spacious outdoor areas, which raised the question, what was an unemployed ex-con doing living out there? Well, the ex-con, a man named Frank Jeffers, had taken to squatting among the bones of a half-built home, and due to some pretty tight legal loopholes, the authorities were unable to effectively remove him. Somehow, Jeffers had managed to get his hands on a small boat, which he used to sail over to the wealthier neighborhoods on the edges of Pinecrest, before absconding after committing petty acts of theft and vandalism. Jeffers had been arrested around half a dozen times, mainly for things like trespassing or harassment, but that's not what he earned a conviction for. You see, about 20 years earlier, Jeffers was arrested after abducting his neighbor's 14-year-old daughter. He bundled her into his car while she was on her way home from school, and if it wasn't for several witnesses reporting the license plate of the car, there's no telling what Jeffers would have done to that girl. The cops pulled him over as he tried driving the girl down into the Everglades. Then he spent 16 years in prison on charges of aggravated kidnapping after he tried and failed to fight the case. Well, now Jeffers was out, and apparently he was up to his old tricks again. It was Mr. Stone who turned the cops' attention onto Jeffers in the first place. His family had been unfortunate enough to have several run-ins with the man, including one incident in which he'd scared the heck out of Stone's then 16-year-old daughter while she was sunbathing. Jeffers had been making a nuisance of himself ever since his release from prison, and by the spring of '82, he constituted the cops' most likely suspect in Kristen Park's abduction. He was questioned on several separate occasions, and his alibis for his whereabouts on the night of the abduction were apparently shaky at best, but lack of solid evidence connecting him to the crime shielded him from arrest or charges. It seemed only a matter of time before police would be able to gather sufficient evidence against him. However, following a break-in at a Pinecrest boating goods store, police attempted to place Jeffers under arrest, but when they rolled up on his half-completed squat, he opened fire on them with a .45 caliber handgun. And as you can imagine, the cops were less than thrilled that Jeffers had suddenly decided to go out with a bang. But still, they obliged him. And following a hail of bullets and buckshot, the number one suspect in Kristen's abduction and assault was no more. I spoke with Mr. Stone following Jeffers' death, and while he expressed regret that the case's number one suspect would never see true justice, he said there were far worse ways for something like that to turn out, and to be honest, I was inclined to agree with him. After covering serious crimes all around Florida and South Carolina for a full 5 years, I knew damn well that when it comes to child predators, the risk of reoffending never truly goes away. Jeffers' death at the hands of police might not have been true justice, but it was a kind of justice all the same, and to the people of Pinecrest, it was like a great weight had been lifted off their shoulders. It seemed like Jeffers had gone and written the end of my article for me, going out in a blaze of inglory, to coin a word. I thought all I needed to do was tie up a few loose ends in terms of some of the info I'd gathered. Then I'd write an article so complete and in-depth that when I turned it into my editor, I might as well staple a raise request to the front cover. But then, those loose ends turned out to be like a loose thread in a knitted sweater, and the more I tugged at them, the more the whole goddamn story as I knew it started to unravel before my very eyes. Jeffers had 2 alibis for the night of Kristen's abduction. To get around, he either had to drive his boat or walk, which is how he ended up drunk out of his mind walking past his neighbor's house on the night of the abduction. By his own admission, Frank Jeffers had been, and I quote, singing drunk, and had been wailing so loud as he walked past his neighbor's place that his neighbor had come to his window to shoot him a very disapproving look. And Jeffers claimed that they locked eyes long enough for him to flip his neighbor the bird, and then after yelling at him to go fornicate with himself, so to speak, the neighbor closed his curtains and presumably went back to sleep. But then, when the cops went to question this neighbor regarding the exchange, he claimed it never happened. No one had any reason to doubt the man. He might have disliked Jeffers, but sure not enough to perjure himself in a court of law, right? Yet it was this particular point of interest that first made me realize that all was not as it seemed. I heard from one officer, who shall remain nameless obviously, that the neighbor had altered his story once he realized Jeffers' freedom was on the line. At first he said he heard Jeffers returning home, but later he changed his story to say he assumed it was Jeffers returning home, but that he never actually laid eyes on him. He hadn't gotten out of bed, and he certainly hadn't shut his curtains after Jeffers had flipped him the bird. Everyone kind of knew the guy was lying. I believe cops when they say that they get a sense for lying, because I developed the exact same thing over the years. But if the guy truly was out of his mind and he hated Jeffers that much that he was willing to perjure himself, then there wasn't much that they could do to stop him, especially when he made such a convenient scapegoat. The second of Jeffers' 2 alibis came from a bar that he went to late that night, a little place down near Cape Florida Beach named Buddy's. And the cops had approached the bar's sole proprietor, who promptly handed over copies of the night's security camera footage. Yet when it came to entering the footage into evidence, they decided it wasn't clear enough of an image of Jeffers and refused to enter it. But then, instead of returning the bar owner's property to him, they neglected to do so. I found that out when I went to talk to him, and since it had just been a blank VHS tape, the guy wasn't exactly ready to lawyer up over it. But he was still pissed about it and used it as a jumping-off point to complain about the cops to me for around 10 minutes straight. And I just let him talk, and then I tried to steer the conversation back in the direction of the security camera footage. And it turns out he had the original tape on site and was more than willing to show it to me. Now bear in mind, this was back in 1982, so even the most cutting-edge security camera footage was still very fuzzy compared to the kind of crystal-clear images you kids can shoot today. But Frank Jeffers wasn't exactly inconspicuous. He liked bright colors, only ever wore a wife-beater, swimming shorts, and a pair of sandals, and had a streak of bleach blonde hair, kind of like a messy mohawk. I guess his fashion sense was part of the reason that he was so easy to ID when it came to all of his petty crimes, and when the owner of Buddy's showed me his security camera footage from that night, there was Frank, clear as day. You couldn't see his face, and I suppose in theory it could have been someone who just so happened to look and dress like him. I'd never personally met the guy, but from how he'd been described, I was confident you could have shown that footage to just about anyone who knew him, and they'd say, "That's Frank Jeffers." And there's no question that it was him. In fact, just about the only question I had at all was, how the hell didn't the footage pass for a positive ID? And to get an answer, I ended up getting in touch with one of the cops who took part in the investigation prior to Jeffers' death. He told me that on the advice of some hotshot attorney they had gotten in touch with, they'd been told the footage was unusable. In the eyes of the law, if it didn't display any prominent facial features, scars, or tattoos, then it couldn't be used by Jeffers' future defense attorneys, and therefore did not constitute an alibi worth taking seriously. I remember telling him how, if that were me on a jury, I'd have no problem considering it some solid evidence if the man himself was stood there right in front of me, with that same streak of blonde hair matching the one on the videotape. But the cop I spoke to just shook his head and told me it was out of his hands. And on the advice of that hotshot attorney, the higher-ups had declared the tape wasn't a sufficient alibi and that Jeffers was to remain the case's primary suspect. And to me, this seemed like a huge mistake, so I was very curious to know who this wise attorney character was. The cop made a phone call, then told me the attorney had been recommended by none other than Mr. Stone. I knew the cops weren't interested in reviewing the tape, but Mr. Stone sure would be, especially if it was his attorney that had made such an error of judgment. I didn't hesitate to contact him, but when I did, he acted in a similarly obtuse manner as the police department. He thanked me for my concern, but advised me to trust in the counsel of his attorney. Jeffers had been the most likely suspect, and now he was dead. Case closed. I asked if he'd seen the security camera footage from the bar out near Cape Florida Beach, and he hadn't. But then when I told him that I was strongly considering the possibility that Kristen Park's attacker hadn't been Jeffers, and that the real one was still out there somewhere, Mr. Stone suddenly snapped at me. I remember him asking, "Just who the hell do you think you are, buddy?" Then, in a roundabout way, he accused me of trying to piggyback on a tragedy to further my career. I told him that was the last thing I was trying to do, and how the only thing that mattered to me was finding Kristen's attacker before he hurt anyone else. Mr. Stone then replied that if that truly was the case, then I'd respect the opinions and judgments of those more qualified than I. Anything less would no doubt only increase the pain and suffering of those affected. The last thing I asked him, before he hung up on me, was if he'd at least come and view the security camera footage for himself. And after that, the phone line went dead. What Stone said about only increasing pain and suffering rattled around my mind for the next couple of days, and I really struggled with the possibility that, deep down, my motivations really were entirely selfish. I figured that in his mind, having the Parks family believe Jeffers was Kristen's attacker gave them a degree of closure, and me convincing them otherwise was simply unacceptable to Mr. Stone, who no doubt wanted the whole morbid chapter of his life to be over and done with. But to me, bringing the real attacker to justice was the greatest gift anyone could possibly bestow upon them. The Parks family didn't need a sense of justice. They needed real justice, and with each passing day it looked more and more like it was up to me to provide it. I never reached out to Kristen before. I didn't think that I really needed to. But in coming up against such a solid brick wall, I figured that I had no other choice but to explore every possible avenue of investigation. Kristen had obviously been interviewed extensively in the aftermath of her ordeal, but I needed to make certain that the cops hadn't missed anything, and so I called her parents and asked if I could talk to her. As I've already mentioned, Kristen had a great deal of difficulty recovering from her ordeal, so her parents weren't too keen on her talking to a reporter, especially not one from such a minor publication. But after a long and heartfelt talk with Kristen's father, Patrick, he invited me over to his home to talk with his daughter. At first, Kristen told me very little that I didn't know already, and anything that was new was irrelevant enough for me to understand why it had been left out of the reports. The only thing that she'd mentioned that I felt was worth noting down was that one of her attackers smelled like cinnamon. And this little detail had not been in any of the police reports. But when I asked Kristen why she'd failed to mention this before, she told me that she had, on numerous occasions in fact, and had no idea why it hadn't been in any of the reports. And that's not the only thing that somehow hadn't made its way into the police reports. I asked if she was 100% certain that it was her attacker who smelled like cinnamon, and not just some kind of ambient scent in the place that she was kept, like an air freshener or something. Kristen told me that she'd never been so sure of anything in her life. She'd been mostly blindfolded, but was certain that while it was two men who abducted her, only one of them ever violated her, and every time he did, Kristen smelled sweet cinnamon on the man's breath. Before leaving, I thanked Kristen for her time and thanked her father for arranging the meeting. The detail about the cinnamon on her attacker's breath was entirely new information to me, and I wondered just what else I was yet to discover. It turns out, the next big detail was just around the corner. Almost everyone in Pinecrest was familiar with Mr. Stone and his daughter, but I'd been investigating the abduction for almost 8 months before I realized that she wasn't an only child. Stone, who had hosted the party, had 2 children, a 17-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old son, and while his daughter was a popular and high-achieving high school junior, his son had not been blessed with intelligence or social skills. Stone's son, who I guess I'll just call Junior, had been diagnosed with learning difficulties at a young age and was transferred to a dedicated special ed school. But that is just about all anyone knew about young Junior. He was rarely seen outside the family home, and when he was always in the company of either his mother or some kind of caretaker. Kids who met him said he was weird and that he mostly stayed up in his bedroom watching horror movies and reading comic books. I asked a few of the kids who were at the party if Junior had come downstairs at all or had tried to mingle with the partygoers. Most said no, that they didn't even know that the Stones had a son. But 2 kids said they had seen an older boy at one point, not wearing a costume and talking to one of Stone's security people. I then got in touch with the cop from Miami-Dade Police Department, the one who told me about Stone's attorney ruling out Jeffers' alibi. He said Junior hadn't been questioned at all regarding the events of that evening, and that as far as the police department knew, he'd been up in his bedroom the whole time. You see what I was saying about how things just started to unravel? I had kids saying Junior had been at the party, if only for a brief period, but then the police department told me point blank that he hadn't come downstairs all night. I asked them how they could be so sure of that, and you know what the cop told me? Because Mr. Stone told us. The next time I called Stone marked the last time we ever spoke. We weren't on great terms after our last phone call, the one where he'd advised me to, in so many words, stop asking questions. So when I called him that last time, he wasn't exactly pleased to hear from me. He picked up the phone, I announced myself, and then when I asked to talk to Junior, he hung up the phone. No questions, no comments, just click, and the line went dead. And that was the early summer of '82, and I didn't give up on the case, not by any stretch, but that call marked the point at which my progress started rapidly slowing down. Without Stone's support and with the police department quickly losing patience with me, it seemed like I had little choice but to put the entire project on the back burner. I had other fish to fry. Not necessarily bigger ones, but I was a reporter, not a cop. Investigations didn't pay the bills, writing articles did, so I wrote articles on other stuff and let Kristen Park's abduction case slowly fade into the background. Now cut to late October of 1982, a full year after the Park's abduction, and with it being Halloween time, I was thinking about it a lot. Halloween that year was a Sunday, my one true day off from work, and I spent the evening shaking homemade rum runners and pondering over the case. Officially speaking, it was closed, but I knew Kristen's attacker was still out there, and befitting the season, it haunted me like a restless spirit. I remember heading to bed that night and realizing that it was the very first time a story had gotten away from me. I imagined myself coming up to 60 years old, still obsessed with this one lingering unsolved case. I'm actually laughing as I type this because my personal prophecy ended up coming true, all except for one little detail. I don't consider it unsolved anymore, and what I didn't realize back then on Halloween night of 1982 was that it wouldn't even be 24 hours before I solved the mystery and not only figure out who abducted Kristen Parks, but why. On Monday, November 1st, I was at the Pinecrest Cash and Carry picking up a few groceries after work. I've been thinking about the Parks case here and there, but with it being a work day, I had much more of my mind on the stuff that I've been working on that day. I remember grabbing a little hamburger helper because I wasn't much of a cook back then, along with a few other items before heading over to the registers. Now I got in line, then when I looked up, I saw the lady in front of me was one of Mr. Stone's housekeepers, who I'd met once or twice while visiting him at home. We exchanged greetings. Then as we were chatting, my eyes wandered to the groceries that she had lined up on the little conveyor belt. Along with an assortment of cleaning items, there was a whole bunch of Halloween candy, and I correctly assumed that the bags had been heavily discounted due to the end of spooky season. But the thing that really got my attention was how there had been at least 5 or 6 bags of the same candy, and that particular candy was atomic fireballs. I remember saying to Anessa, Stone's housekeeper, that someone must have really liked those candies. I remembered them from when I was a kid, but I never did like that name, Fireballs. Having my mouth burn just wasn't what I was looking for in a candy, so I never paid any interest in them on account of their name alone. And that's half the reason that I made the comment in the first place, just wondering which little psycho liked the idea of sucking on an atomic fireball instead of maybe a Jolly Rancher or Lemonhead. Anessa looked at me, kind of chuckled a little, then told me that they were all for Mr. Stone's son, Junior. That he loved those candies more than anything, and that they probably helped some dentist buy himself a boat to go with his vacation house down in Key West. And by that point, Anessa was packing her purchases into her paper bags, and just as she picked up the last bag of fireballs, she takes a look at the bag and then at me and says something like, "Ugh, cinnamon." There was a very, very brief moment, maybe only a millisecond, where I thought to myself, huh? I never knew they were cinnamon flavored. And then, everything dropped like the meteorite that wiped out the dinosaurs. Cinnamon, the exact same scent Kristen Parks had smelled on her attacker whenever he violated her. Cinnamon, the favored candy of Stone's son, who lived his life watching splatter films in a windowless room on the 3rd floor and was seen talking to the security guard who just so happened to be the last person to see or talk to Kristen Parks at that party. Frank Jeffers didn't have a van. He also didn't have a place to hold a teenage girl prisoner for a few days either. Not somewhere secure, like a storage unit, which is exactly where Kristen believed that she was being held. But Mr. Stone, who suddenly didn't seem so excited on seeking justice for Kristen when the investigation suddenly involved his family, he had the means to purchase or rent just about anything, and maybe, just maybe, had the money and the will to buy his socially inept son a little private time with a young friend of his sister's that had caught his eye. Back then, as I put it all together, it almost seemed too crazy to even contemplate. Stone was a pillar of this community, someone who was either respected, admired, or loved. To even entertain the idea that he was a cold-blooded psychopath who facilitated the abduction and violation of an underage girl, it seemed like sheer madness. But then the more I thought about it, the more it started to make all the sense in the world. The gathering hadn't been a Halloween party at all. It had been a teenage meat market from which Junior could select his victim. The next chance I got, I told my editor that I wanted to talk to him, and through a series of oddly specific hypotheticals, I told him what I was thinking and how I'd arrived at that position. As you can imagine, he stared at me slack-jawed for half the time I talked, especially towards the end when I got to all the stuff about Junior, or more specifically, how he should have been the #1 suspect but was never even questioned. My editor thought about it for maybe 15 to 20 seconds, then told me that as long as I could write it in a way that didn't get us sued into oblivion, Then he'd get it checked over by the paper's legal department, then out onto the presses. If all we were doing was asking the right questions, we'd be protected by the First Amendment, and there was nothing Stone could do about it. But, as we came to find out, that wasn't entirely true. A few days later, I was about a third of my way through the article when my editor called me into his office and showed me a draft copy of the next morning's paper. Right in the middle 2 pages of the paper, Mr. Stone had bought a full-page ad for his boat showroom and another page to exclusively advertise his new Sea-Doo range of jet skis. Stone had signed a 24-month-long advertising deal with his employers, one worth almost $100,000. He knew that with that amount of money at stake, there was no way in hell that the paper's owner would run a negative story about him, and as a result, my editor told me that we'd have to kill the junior story. It might sound weird, but I wasn't surprised. Seeing that giant ad almost knocked me off my goddamn feet, but I remember thinking, of course he bought an ad. Of course he did. He had all the power in the world, and I was just a goddamn scribe for a crappy small-town newspaper. If I pushed things any further, I'd probably end up with a pair of cement shoes or something. So instead of potentially risking my life, as well as my job, I opted for survival and killed that story. I remember an old black and white movie that I saw once when I was a kid. I can't remember what it was about, but some beautiful broad was crying to some bogey wannabe and how unfair and unjust the world is. In response, the bogey wannabe said something like, "That's the way the world works, kid. Always has. Always will." When I first heard that, I didn't believe it was true. But I feel like the whole process of growing up and becoming an adult is finding out that it is, and that a truer statement has never been spoken. Hi, Let's Read. I'm a long-time listener who happens to be very active in the comments section of your videos. I never had a reason to write to you before, but that all changed last October after a group of neighborhood kids decided to harass me, gaslight me, and otherwise make my life a living hell. I also want to take the opportunity to issue trigger warnings for poor mental health, pathogen anxiety, gang stalking, and interactions with cops. Sometimes I really wish you'd do better and make an effort to protect your audience by issuing the appropriate trigger warnings, but I guess no one's perfect. First off, sorry but not sorry here. I hate Halloween, because if there was ever a day of the year that exemplifies all that's wrong with modern-day America, it's October 31st. To me, it represents the absolute peak of our vapid, disposable culture, a time of year when corporate fat cats make millions off of morons buying masks they're only going to wear for a few hours. Now, don't get me wrong, I love candy just as much as the next guy, but turning the whole thing into a giant capitalist circle jerk disgusts me more and more each year. I hate Halloween, but that doesn't mean that I don't tolerate it. But then, by tolerate, I mean I don't sit out on my step with a bucket full of rocks, ready to hurl them at any kids who step onto my driveway. I don't leave a bowl of candy out for the little brats who, by the way, almost always come from rich families who don't need to be extorting food from these less fortunate than them. But I do leave a sign out front saying, "No trick-or-treating, no exceptions," so they know not to knock on my door. The sign worked in 2021, and it also worked as intended in 2022, which, by the way, they shouldn't have been out. But last year, a group of kids decided to completely ignore it and came walking up my driveway to knock on my door. When I heard someone knocking, I assumed it couldn't possibly be trick-or-treaters, so when I opened the door and saw a bunch of kids wearing cheap, full-body Marvel hero costumes, I was not pleased. First off, they looked way too old to be trick-or-treating. The kid in the Iron Man costume looked like he was 12, 13 at the most, and when they all said trick-or-treat in unison, it sounded so entitled that it made me want to barf. I looked down at the kid who was attempting to look like Tony Stark and told him that his costume wasn't even lore accurate. He looked at me kind of funny and asked what I was talking about, so I told him that the circle on the Iron Man's chest is called the arc reactor. It's supposed to be yellow. The fact that it's blue in those dumb Corpo Fest movies is a stylistic choice. They made it a vibranium core to sell more Black Panther tickets, when traditionally, the reactor has been depicted as yellow or gold to signify different technological iterations. And by the time I was finished, all 4 kids were looking at me like I was speaking another language, so I just stepped back inside and told them to buzz off and then slammed the door in their faces. I deal with a lot of generalized anxiety, and pathogen control is a huge trigger for me, so just that minor interaction had me feeling extremely uneasy as I went and sat back down in my computer chair. But no sooner had I sat down than I had heard someone knocking at my door for a second time. I knew who it was. There was no way it could have been anyone but those kids again, so I stomped back towards my front door, opened it up, and then lo and behold, it was the trashy Marvel kids in their cringy costumes. When I asked what they wanted this time, the kid in the Iron Man costume told me, "You know we gotta trick you now, right?" And that alone infuriated me. But as he and his little friend started to laugh at how angry they'd made me, I just exploded. I yelled that if they came anywhere near my house again, I'd be contacting their parents, and then for the second time in what felt like as many minutes, I slammed the door in their faces. I was almost shaking with anger by the time that I got back to my computer because the level of entitlement in those brats was just off the scale. They had completely ignored my no trick or treating sign. In fact, I feel like there's a good chance that the sign was the only reason they knocked on my door in the first place. They were lucky I'm not the kind of person to call or talk to the cops for any reason. Otherwise, I'd have been dialing 911 and giving their description to the dispatcher. But being the decent and private person that I am, I don't ever call or talk to the police. And I tried calming myself down a little with breathing exercises and then tried playing a little Overwatch in hopes that that might mellow me out. But then, we're talking no more than 5 or 10 minutes later, I hear someone knocking on my door for a third time. I recall being totally unable to stop myself from letting out a sort of screech of frustration as I marched towards the front door, and when I swung it open, with a face that probably looked like thunder, I saw a very alarmed-looking lady and a group of kids, and when I yelled at them, asking if they were blind and couldn't see my sign, they told me there was no sign. I kind of scooted past the grown-up lady so I could see my porch fully. Then when I saw that there was no sign, I felt like I was about to pass out. Those evil Marvel kids had stolen it, I think. And I screamed at the kids and the lady to get the hell off of my property and then walk back into my house and close the door. I had to take a seat on my stairs for fear of hitting my head if I passed out, and then decided if I didn't take something, I was probably going to have a really bad night in terms of my anxiety. They always make me feel a little drowsy, but they're super fast acting and they always hit the spot when I need it. And I took one, put up a fresh sign saying no trick-or-treaters, but this time in my window so no one could steal it, and then went on with my evening in peace. But that peace probably only lasted an hour. I had just started my second playthrough of one of my more favorite games when, through the wall of sound my headphones provided, I heard thunk, 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 and like one hollow bang and then 2 more in quick succession. The first scared the living hell out of me, but the second and third sound sounded almost familiar, and I had an immediate idea of what had just happened. And lo and behold, on the outside of the window pane where I placed my no trick-or-treaters sign, 3 broken eggs were dripping down the glass. And I was so angry that I was almost completely dissociating. I remember seeing the eggs, then the next thing I remember, I was in the fetal position in my bathtub pretty much with the knuckles of my right hand all swollen and bloody. I took a second pill, and then took a shower, and then put some salve on my knuckle before I decided to just take a nap. If I hadn't calmed down by the time my alarm went off, then I'd just call it quits on the whole day and then take enough melatonin and doxy to knock myself out for the whole night. And that was around 7, and when I woke up at around 9, I felt much calmer, so I figured I'd just go play some more Overwatch to take my mind off of things. Before that, I needed to eat. So I got dressed, walked downstairs, and went into my kitchen to get myself some snacks. None of the lights were on in my house, and I prefer low light or darkness when I first wake up to prevent sensory overload, so I figured that it must have looked like I'd gone out or had headed to bed for the night, because no sooner had I lined up some bread slices ready for the PB&J than I heard the distinct sound of someone softly stepping on the loose paving slab around the side of my house. The guys I hired didn't level the foundations of the driveway properly, so around the side, near the gate leading to my backyard, there was this one loose slab of stone that rocked and knocked whenever you stood on it. Even if you stood on it very lightly, there'd still be this sort of soft dunk sound, and that's the exact sound I heard coming through my open kitchen window. My first reaction was to sneak back upstairs to my bedroom, where I planned on hiding until whoever it was had finished whatever they were doing. I didn't mind losing some stuff to some unhoused folks in a home robbery, but I was terrified that whoever it was might want to assault me or do something terrible, which would only add to the mountain of trauma I'm already burdened with. But then, and excuse the potential for over-description here, but as I got to the bottom of my stairs, something caught my eye through the unfrosted portion of my front door's glass panel. It's mostly frosted, but there are small strips around the outside that are fully transparent. I glanced towards the door as I reached the bottom of the stairs, but I didn't see a white crime van parked at the end of my driveway, or more unhoused folks making their way towards my door, and instead, I saw a group of kids dressed in regular clothes who looked an awful lot like the Marvel kids who had knocked on my door just a few hours earlier, around the same heights. It wasn't some home invader creeping around the back of my house. It was one of the trick-or-treaters, no doubt, come to do some additional tricking in my backyard. I slipped on my sneakers and headed towards the back door in my kitchen, which led out into the backyard. I waited a few seconds, hand on the doorknob, and then flung it open as fast as I could, rushing out into the backyard to be greeted by none other than the Iron Man kid. And I don't think I have the words to describe the kind of satisfaction I felt when I saw the look of pure terror in his beady rat's eyes. It was glorious, and I felt like an avenging angel as I slammed my body into him as he tried to escape. He had only one way to run, but since I caught him by surprise, I was able to cut him off in a very effective manner. I'd never been much of a fighter, and I never played any sports in high school at all, so I didn't know the first thing about tackling or taking anybody down. But let me tell you, throwing all 243 pounds of myself at this kid, as hard as I could manage, that sure as hell did the trick. He smashed into the wood fencing at the side of my house so hard he basically slid down it afterwards before trying to find his feet again. I say tried because you can bet your ass that I didn't let him, and when he tried to scream, I found myself instinctually going for his throat and mouth to stifle his cries. And he was so much shorter than me and so much weaker that it almost seemed way too easy to just snatch him up like that. And then one by one I wrapped both my hands around his throat and squeezed. The way it cut off all of his breath and completely silenced him was nothing short of exquisite, I might add. But as I squeezed and squeezed, lifting him off the ground and feeling his little legs kicking out underneath him, I realized that if I squeezed any harder, I'd be in danger of crushing his neck and outright killing him. I didn't want to kill him, I just wanted to scare the kid, and since I happened to know the difference between choking his breath and choking his artery, don't ask how I know this, I decided to mess with him a little bit. I loosened up my overall grip on his neck, but focused my grip on either side of his larynx, which had the effect of slowing down the blood supply to his brain. And that's all I had to do was count to 5, and the kid went from flailing around like a fish out of water to limp as a wet noodle. I shouldn't have laughed, but my God, did his dumb little face look hilarious as he started to snore. His eyelids were half open and his eyes were rolling into their sockets as I laid him down and started dragging him further into my backyard. The kid woke up again by the time we reached the grass, but he was so woozy and lightheaded that not only did he have no clue what was happening, but he didn't seem to know where he was either. He said a name, Brian or Ryan or something, thinking maybe it was his friend and not me who was dragging him across the grass, I think. But when I stopped dragging him and he turned to look, I got to enjoy a second look of pure, pant-wetting fear in his beady little eyes. He managed to stammer out something like, "Please don't," before I started to approach him. Then as he rolled over and tried to get up and run off with his back to me, I took an arm around his throat and began to choke him again. I have to reiterate at this point, I'm not a bad guy, so at no point did I actually plan on killing this kid. But having said that, it was still a lot of fun making him think that I was going to do so. And as I squeezed in just the right spot on his neck, I told him those were the final few moments of his life. Then just as he really started to buck and roll around, He went limp again, and then I laid him back down in the grass. I kinda wish that I had the presence of mind to get it all on camera, because I think I'd have watched it back 100 times by now, just laughing at how darkly humorous this all really was. I'd have sent the kid and his family a copy of the recording too, just so they can see the moment that I laid him down in the turf and began stroking his hair. I wasn't trying to be creepy about it, and I didn't do it because it excited me, not in the way that you're probably thinking. I did it because that time, it really did look like he was just sleeping, and he made that weird snoring sound even louder than the first time. A few seconds later, when he woke up for a second time, he was just as confused and groggy as the first. Then right as he looked at me, almost to ask, "Who are you?" I told him, "You're dead, kid. Welcome to hell." And at that moment, he peed his pants. The kid straight up peed his pants right there in front of me as tears started to well up in his eyes and he starts to hyperventilate. I had to smack him, full force across the face to stop him from going into shock, I think. And this kid must have been 12 or 13 at the minimum. And that's a man in some cultures, and there he was, bawling his eyes out like a little baby just 'cause he got choked out a couple of times for retribution. And I think his memory started to come back to him in that moment because he started blubbering, I'm so sorry," in between his little sobs. I had the presence of mind not to say anything at all for a moment. I just drank in the image before me, thinking, I did this. I took control. And I hadn't felt real pride like that in so long, and I could have done so much more to that kid, but I decided enough was enough and it was time to let him leave. Just not without a little warning first. I told him by sneaking onto my property, he was lucky that I hadn't killed him. I also told him I had a right to peace and privacy, and so whatever conflict we had ended there and then because I wasn't about to call a bunch of brain-dead cops for the sake of some dumb kid. But in return, I expected the same from him. He was going to keep his mother effing mouth shut, and if he didn't, if I got so much as a whiff that he told another living soul of what had happened that night, I was going to saw through his mom's neck with a hacksaw after violating her in front of him. And then, when I was done with her, I was going to do the exact same thing to his dad, only in reverse. I told him I didn't care if I went to jail or whatnot, that my life was a living hell, and I'd be better off getting all that free medical care than having to pay for it myself. And I asked him if he understood, and he nodded his head, and then off he went, scampering into the night with piss running down his legs, and I could smell it. Well, long story short, the kid did tell someone, and I've had the cops harassing me all year. And all because that little jerk couldn't keep his mouth shut and take his punishment like a man instead of sniveling like a little boy about to vandalize my backyard. I told the cops my truth, which was how some dumb kid had tried breaking into my house and that all I'd done was teach him how that wasn't a good idea. I did acknowledge that I grabbed him, dragged him around a little bit and shoved him off my property, but I did leave out some of the parts, which I'm sure you can all agree is that he completely deserved. And I think that's only fair, though, because the kid said nothing about throwing eggs at my window or stealing my sign. He left out that little part. And you have to ask yourself, which is worse, criminal damage and theft of property, or a little rough and tumble with a kid that I did an effing favor for in teaching him a lesson? He had no right to be on my property. He had no right to steal my stuff. He effed around, and he found out. And if I do end up getting arrested over this, maybe I should follow through with my little promise to baby Tony Stark. Maybe I'll find out where he lives, where Mommy and Daddy lay their heads, and show him how some people are not to be messed with. And I'll be damned happy to submit a follow-up from jail. Just prior to 10 p.m. on Saturday, October 30th of 1993, 3 men walked through the doors of a single-story red brick bar named The Rising Sun. The Rising Sun is situated in the northern Irish village of Greysteel, a Catholic-majority town of just over 1,000 people which lies on the northwestern coast of County Londonderry. That evening, the bar was hosting a Halloween party for the town's residents, with a great number of them donning creepy costumes before descending on the rising sun to drink and dance till the wee small hours of the morning. When the three men walked into the bar, they were wearing matching dark blue boiler suits, with only their mouths and eyes visible underneath coal-black balaclavas. Their sudden presence was barely noted by the bar's occupants, who believed their outfits were little more than costumes. But the men had not arrived to enjoy the party. They had not brought joy or revelry. Instead, they brought only death. Just 7 days earlier, 2 delivery men drove a blue Ford Escort into Belfast from nearby Ardoyne. They parked just around the corner from Frizzle's Fish Soup on the Shank Hill Road. Then, after retrieving a heavy gym bag from their trunk, they began carrying it towards the fishmongers. Seeing as it was shortly after 1 p.m. on a Saturday when the 2 delivery men arrived, the fishmongers were extremely busy. So busy, in fact, one of the delivery men, Thomas Begley, had to wade through the crowd of customers alone, having hoisted the gym bag into both arms. His plan was to place the delivery on the refrigerated counter in front of him, but the 5-pound bag did not contain even an ounce of seafood. Because Thomas Begley and his companion Sean Kelly were not couriers of perishable goods, they were members of the Irish Republic Army's Belfast Brigade, and instead of fish, the bag Begley was carrying contained a highly volatile, homemade bomb. Begley's plan had been to place the bomb onto the counter, announce that it contained an explosive device, and then order the fishmonger's proprietor and customers to make a swift exit. The civilians on the ground floor of the shop were not his intended target, and in reality, the bomb was intended for those on the shop's second floor. You see, that afternoon, the second floor of Frizzle's Fish Shop was the location of a meeting between leaders of the IRA's arch-rivals, the Ulster Defense Association. Formed in September of 1971 and intended as a kind of parent organization to various armed militant groups who remained loyal to the British Crown, the UDA's twin goals were to defend Northern Ireland's Protestant population and to combat what was referred to as the militant republicanism of its IRA enemies. According to intelligence provided to Begley and Kelly, some of the most high-ranked UDA officials in the country will be packed into an upstairs room on that dreary Saturday afternoon, meaning just one well-placed bomb could potentially wipe out their entire leadership. But despite the IRA's meticulous planning, they got 2 things horribly wrong. The first was that the UDA's meeting had ended hours earlier, and the second floor of the fishmongers was completely unoccupied. The UDA's leadership made a habit of disseminating false information, even among its lower-ranking operatives, to ensure their movements and whereabouts were difficult to track. As far as most people knew, their meeting was due to commence at around 1 p.m., but in reality, it started at around 10 a.m., meaning that by 1 o'clock that afternoon, not a single member of the UDA's inner council was present when the 2 IRA operatives arrived with their bomb. But this was only the lesser of the IRA's 2 mistakes that day. The primary one was enlisting the help of a Catholic bomb maker with extremely subpar bomb-making skills. As Sean Kelly waited near the fishmonger's door, his role being to shepherd customers off the premises, Thomas Begley hoisted the gym bag onto a refrigerated counter in front of him. Once he'd set it down, Begley planned to announce that he had a bomb and that all innocent civilians should vacate the area. But Begley didn't even get a chance to speak. The moment he set the explosives hold all down onto the fishmonger's counter, the bomb inside of it suffered a catastrophic malfunction and detonated prematurely. Begley was killed instantly. In fact, he was practically vaporized by the 5 pounds of explosives the device employed. But sadly, he was not the only one to lose his life. 63-year-old John Frizzle, the fishmonger's owner, was also killed instantly when Begley's bomb exploded, along with his 29-year-old daughter, Sharon, and 13-year-old Leanne Murray. The IRA did indeed assassinate a member of the Ulster Defense Association that day, in the form of 27-year-old Michael Morrison, who just so happened to have stopped by to pick up some fish. Yet their bomb also killed his partner, Evelyn Baird, along with their 7-year-old daughter, Michelle. 63-year-old George Williams also died in the blast along with his wife, Gillian, while 38-year-old Wilma McKee was crushed to death when the force of the blast caused the old building to collapse into a pile of rubble. In total, almost 60 people were injured by shattered masonry and flying glass. Then, over the next several hours, broken bodies and bloodied survivors alike were dragged from the debris by a mixture of emergency services and frantic volunteers. In the aftermath of what became known as the Shankill road bombing, there was an outpouring of ferocious indignation from Belfast's Protestant community. One prominent member of the UDA, Billy the Twister McQuiston, told a British journalist that, and I quote, "Anybody on the Shankill Road that day, from a Boy Scout to a granny, would have gone out and retaliated if you've given them a gun." Even though the IRA's plan of attack had sought to minimize civilian casualties, its disastrous execution meant most people saw the bombing as a despicable and indiscriminate attack on Protestant civilians. Rather than a targeted assassination of the UDA's command and control element, Shankill's Protestant community believed the bomb had worked exactly as intended. But UDA chieftain, Mad Dog Johnny Adair, knew different. Adair knew that he and his fellow Inner Circle had been the bombing's true target, but as the commander of sectarian militants, community tensions were his bread and butter, and he wasn't about to let a good crisis go to waste. That night, as he departed his home in a personal vehicle, Mad Dog Adair was stopped by Northern Irish police officers, and when asked where he was going, Adair simply replied, "I'm away to plan a mass murder." Detaining him meant signing the death warrants of many of their fellow officers, so the police officers allowed Adair to go about his business, knowing all too well that killing was his business, and business was good. At Adair's behest, the UDA's leadership ordered immediate reprisals. Just hours after the bombing, the UDA claimed responsibility for the fatal shooting of a Catholic delivery driver after he was lured to a bogus call on the outskirts of Belfast. Then on October 26th, the UDA murdered 2 additional Catholic civilians in a machine gun attack on a Belfast council building that saw 5 others seriously wounded. Both attacks satisfied the UDA leadership's desire for vengeance, but the attack's true purpose was to serve as a distraction. Make British security services believe that their target was Belfast Catholics, and the redistribution of security forces would leave more provincial targets much more vulnerable. Targets like the Rising Sun Bar, Lounge, and Restaurant over in Greysteel County, Londonderry. When it was discovered that the Rising Sun was throwing a Halloween party on Saturday, October 30th, the UDA leadership ordered the commander of their Londonderry brigade, Billy McFarland, to plan and execute an attack. McFarland called 3 of his top henchmen, Stephen Irwin, Geoffrey Deeney, and Torrance Knight, then arranged to meet them at a safe house near the target. They met on October 27th after making the safe house their base of operations, began planning out their attack on the Rising Sun. They even performed a reconnaissance mission and stopped by the bar for drinks one night to scout out entrances, exits, and optimal firing positions. It's chilling to think about. Just a few nights before the attack, the bar patrons shared drinks with the same men that, just a few nights later, would return to murder them. Finally, on the evening of October 30th, 1993, Irwin, Deeney, and Knight traveled by car to the Rising Sun, with a 4th man driving ahead of them as a scout. When the scout observed that the Halloween party was in full swing, he gave the nod to the UDA kill team, who parked their stolen Opel Kadett outside the bar and then walked inside wearing boiler suits and balaclavas. When 3 men walked inside armed with an assault rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a semi-automatic pistol, some partygoers believed it was nothing more than a practical joke. 1 or 2 of them laughed at the sight of the men, dressed in their matching boiler suits, poorly fitting masks, and old replica firearms. But while they might have been old, their weapons were most certainly not mere replicas, and as more and more of the bar's patrons realized what was happening, they fell silent. When Stephen Irwin, armed with a Czech AK variant known as the VZ-58, saw the terror in his victim's eyes, he smiled. Then after raising his rifle, he screamed, "Trick or treat," before he began shooting. Jeff Deeney, armed with a 9mm handgun, fired a single bullet at a woman trying to flee before his weapon jammed, and he spent the remainder of the attack trying to clear the stoppage, but was not calm or cool-handed enough to do so. Torrance Knight, armed with the shotgun, guarded the entrance while the shooting was taking place, and was the only one not to fire his weapon in anger. Stephen Irwin, on the other hand, fired a total of 60 steel-jacketed bullets at the partygoers from his fully automatic assault rifle. It took just over 2 seconds to spray the interior of the Rising Sun with exactly 30 rounds of .7.62 ammunition, with each round traveling at over 700 meters per second. They chewed through the wooden frames of tables and chairs, punched fist-sized holes through human bodies, and sent glass splinters exploding across the room at speeds that caused them to become embedded in the unfortunate patron's flesh. When Irwin's rifle magazine ran dry and his rifle ceased to fire, a grim silence returned to the interior of the Rising Sun, broken only by the groans of the gravely wounded. Irwin's torrent of hellfire had been devastating, but the bar's terrified occupants believed the shooting was over. They began slowly emerging from their hiding places, only to see Irwin replacing his empty magazine with a full one. One woman began begging Irwin not to begin shooting again. He simply ignored her, continued to reload his weapon, then sent the first of his new bullets through her skull. People scrambled for cover as Irwin once again began spraying the room's occupants at random, and again it took mere seconds for him to send an astonishing amount of lead ripping and tearing through fixtures and figures alike. When Irwin's second magazine ran out, survivors heard him laughing as he surveyed the death and destruction he'd wrought. Irwin was still cackling as he walked outside, climbing into their stolen car and escaped with his fellow gunmen. The first emergency services to arrive on the scene later described it as a living hell. Dead and dying patrons were scattered across the dance floor, while entire sections of the floor had become glittering puddles of blood and broken glass. 8 people had been killed outright, while 19 were treated in a hospital for serious injuries. 6 of the dead were Catholics, while, ironically, 2 of them were Protestants. The deceased were identified as Karen Thompson, aged 19, and Stephen Mullen, aged 20. Also among the dead were Moira Duddy, 59, and Joseph McDermott, 60. The others included James Moore, age 81, John Moyne, age 50, John Burns, age 54, and Victor Montgomery, age 76. The following day, the Ulster Defense Association claimed responsibility for the massacre, referred to it as a raid, and stated that the murders were, quote, the continuation of our threats against the nationalist electorate that would pay a heavy price for last Saturday's slaughter of 9 Protestants. A UDA member from West Belfast claimed their gunmen, quote, had information that senior IRA men drank in the Rising Sun. Unfortunately, they were not there on Halloween, but our boys acted on the briefing they had been given. The UDA's public relations wing acted with the same dour professionalism synonymous with the Troubles, but behind the scenes, there was sickening jubilation. The gunmen were welcomed home as heroes, with Stephen Irwin being particularly boastful of his wanton act of savagery. He gloated that he'd executed a Catholic woman who'd begged him not to end her life, proud that he exhibited the same lack of mercy as those who destroyed Frizzle's fishmongers. Thanks to the British Security Service having heavily infiltrated both Catholic and Protestant paramilitary groups, identifying the gunmen was remarkably simple. Since they were boasting of their involvement, the names of the gunmen made their way from pub to club until they reached the ears of British informants. Over the weeks that followed, Stephen Irwin, Jeffrey Deeney, and Torrance Knight were hunted down and arrested, then taken into custody by Northern Ireland's police service. During his first appearance on the stand, Torrance Knight was filmed laughing, taunting, and shouting abuse at the victims' relatives before being led from the courthouse by bailiffs. Jeffrey Deeney remained silent. But Stephen Irwin, responsible for the vast majority of injuries and deaths, called his crimes, and I quote, payback, before adding that he'd had no remorse. And finally, in February of 1995, all three men were sentenced to life imprisonment for their involvement in what became known as the Grey Steel Massacre. Torrance Knight then received an additional life sentence for his involvement in the Cattle Rock killings, in which 3 innocent Catholics were shot and killed by UDA gunmen. All 3 men should have spent the rest of their lives in prison, but because of clauses in the peace deal known as the Good Friday Agreement, Irwin, Deeney, and Knight were released in the year 2000, less than 5 full years into their supposedly lifelong prison terms. The Good Friday Agreement saw the release of many such dangerous prisoners on both sides of the political and religious divides. Michael Stone, infamous for his grenade and gun attack at the funeral of a slain IRA man, saw freedom long before his sentence was up, as did Patrick McGee, who attempted to assassinate the British Prime Minister in the 1984 Brighton hotel bombing. But another prisoner to win his freedom thanks to the agreement was Sean Kelly, the sole survivor of the IRA bomb team who prematurely detonated their device in the fishmongers on the Shankill Road, all in the name of progress. Alan Gillis, a poet and native son of Belfast, wrote a poem of the same title, Progress, and it reads as follows. They say that for years Belfast was backwards, and it's great now to see some progress. So I guess we can look forward to taking boxes from the earth. I guess that ambulances will leave the dying back amidst the rubble to be explosively healed. Given time, 100,000 particles of glass will create impossible patterns in the air before coalescing into the clarity of a window, through which a reassembled head will look out and admire the shy young man taking his bomb from the building and driving home. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends.